We are studying the life of David, and we're focusing on the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, by the way, the Jewish Bible, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament's referred to in a lot of ways, but basically, your Bible has all the same books and all the same content that the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures have. But, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Samuel is one book. And so it was split by Christians for various reasons, nothing nefarious. It was just split in two, and it happened to be split at the death of Saul, and that's where we are in our story. If you remember, and we're just going to start with the map because I want to remind you what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 31. That's the end of 1 Samuel. And then our lesson will be in 2 Samuel, chapters 1 through about the middle of chapter 5, I think is about as far as we'll get. But if you remember, this map on the right is Saul is going out to meet the Philistines. This is the Jordan River. Saul actually lives in the south. The Philistines they live over here on the coast. They're coming way inland. So Saul, on Mount Gilboa, gathers the Israelites, and the picture in the lower left is Mount Gilboa. And you're looking at it from Beth-shan. Beth-shan is a town on the other side of the valley. This is a valley, the Jezreel Valley. It's wide, broad, flat, great place to fight a battle. There may have been more battles fought in the Jezreel Valley than anywhere else on earth throughout all of history. So basically, you're standing on a hill on the other side of the valley in a town called Beth-shan, and looking across, and that's what that picture is, and that is Mount Gilboa, and that's where Saul and the Israelites were gathered. The Philistines were coming up this valley of Jezreel, and they get right in front of Mount Gilboa, and they attack the Israelites. Now, they are way inside Israelite territory. I mean, think about it. We're at the Jordan River. They live on the coast. And so what you see happening in Saul's kingship is they're losing. The Philistines are overcoming them. You know, Saul has, we've said this before, but I'll repeat it a lot of times because you're going to see this over and over. Saul begins by trusting God, but then he places his trust, and so do the Israelites, in political, military alliances. In other words, they try to solve their life problems with political, military solutions instead of turning to God. And when he does that, they lose. In other words, they're not successful. Now, they're not successful for a lot of reasons. The Israelites don't have the technology that the Philistines have. They don't have the tactics. They're really deficient in a lot of ways. They're living in the highlands. They have no, seriously, if you put it in 21st century terms, they have no military industrial complex. They have no manufacturing. They don't know how to make bronze. They really are at a deficit. And so you can't be too hard on Saul. Nevertheless, when they trust God, they win. You know, David defeats Goliath. And the same story would happen for Saul, but Saul's not faithful. So they meet in this valley, and then the tail end, this is the very end of 1 Samuel. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them. Many fell slain on Mount Gilboa, so the Israelites are routed. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Now, Saul has one other son, but these three sons were fighting with him, and they killed them. And they also killed Saul. So Saul, his three sons, his armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. And so the Israelites fled. They literally left the promised land. They crossed. I'll show you another map in a minute. After the dust settles from this battle, they literally crossed the Jordan River out of the promised land. So this is sort of a reverse exodus. 400 years before, Moses brought them here. Joshua led them in. They trust God. They conquered this land. 400 years later, they're basically kicked out of the land by the Philistines. And so they nail the body of Saul to the walls of Beth-shan. I showed you those walls are still intact today, portions of them. And the Israelites are just disheartened. So Saul is dead. And David, when he hears about it, David is not fighting. He'd been fighting with the Philistines, but he's not with the Philistines fighting against his own people. And so he's back in the south, and he hears the words. And when he does, this is one of the most beautiful passages. So as 2 Samuel opens, in other words, just the very next passage, it says, and I'll just read this to you because I think this is really worth hearing. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan and ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament, this song. When we're in Israel, the first time we have a guide that we like. He's a Jewish guide. He's a Jew. He's a great guide. Yehuda is his name. And so we're standing there at Bet Shan, and we're looking right across at Mount Gilboa, and I'm telling this story. And I tell this story while we're there. And when I get to this part, because I like to read this so you can feel, David and Jonathan were closer than brothers. And even though Saul had tried to kill David, David never retaliated. He was very faithful in this. And he starts singing this song. And I said, "You got to be kidding me. You know this?" He said, "Every Israeli child knows this because you learn this song in elementary school," and he could just sing it. And so this song is still sung as part of their heritage in elementary school. But here's what David says: "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your heights. How the mighty have fallen." I just want you to notice this. I want to point out a little literary element. So, how the mighty have fallen. "Tell it not in Gath," that's one of the Philistine cities. "Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon," another Philistine city, "lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan," this is another piece now. "Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished." And so this is a song, and it's like a psalm. The Psalms are prayers, but they're also sung. The book of Psalms in the Old Testament was basically the hymnal of Israel, and so they would sing these psalms. This is a prayer, it's a lament, it's a psalm of sadness, and it contains some literary elements. That "how the mighty has fallen" is called an inclusio. I'm telling you this so that when you read in the Old Testament, you'll see this quite a bit. You'll see a phrase repeated at the beginning and the end, and that's called an inclusio, an inclusion, if you will. And it's an oral mechanism for when you're hearing things. When you hear that repetition, you know that by the way, we do that in songs. We sing a verse, and then what do we sing? Chorus. Verse, chorus. And this is a similar kind of a thing. But then he tacks on just a very powerful emotional appeal for his grief for Jonathan as well. So David's response is grief over this. Now, that's a little unusual. I mean, he's been anointed probably 10 years ago, probably anointed by Samuel to be king 10 years ago. And for most of his 20s, Saul has been trying to kill him. And yet, when he hears this news, he realizes this is more than about Saul. It's more than about him. It's about Israel. It's about Israel's lack of faith to her God, and now Israel is decimated. I mean, the Israelites are scattered. They're kicked out of their land. I mean, it's a low point for Israel. But you would think, though, at this point, you think, well, Saul is dead. David's been anointed. David's going to become king. And you would be almost right. Walter Brueggemann said this. He said, "Real history never happens in a straight line of clean motivations." And we've certainly seen that so far. It happens rather by odd alliances, strange loyalties, and daring choices through which the faithful discern the working out of Yahweh's intent. What's he saying? He's basically saying that as you read this story, this reads like real life. So in other words, David's not just going to walk in now and say, hey, Saul died, I'll be king now. It's not that clean. It's not that straightforward. It's just like you're in my life. Things don't always work the way you think they're supposed to work. They tend to zig and zag, and yet it seems as though the hand of God, the Spirit of God, is working through these events to get us where God wills us to go. And so David will become king by the end of this lesson, but it's not a straight path to get there. So let's talk about what happens to David and how this plays out. So 2 Samuel chapter 2, in the course of time, David inquired of the Lord. Well, this is interesting. What does David do first? He prays. He says, God, what would you have me do next? He says, shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah? Meaning, is it time for me to become king? Is it time for your anointing to take effect? And the Lord said, go up. And David asked, where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family. Remember, he had about 600 men and their families. They settled in Hebron and its towns, in other words, a surrounding area. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So if you remember, there are 12 tribes of Israel. And so when they come into this land 400 years earlier, they had allotments of land. So the 12 sons of Jacob, whose other name was Israel, so they were the 12 sons of Israel, their families became the 12 tribes of Israel. They are the Israelite people. And so they're a tribal group. Well, one of these tribes is the tribe of Judah. That was one of the sons. And so David is anointed king over the tribe of Judah, not over the other 11. And let me show you what's going on geographically here. So Saul, I mentioned, has one other son, and his name was actually Ishbaal, and it was changed to Ishbosheth. So Ishbosheth was his fourth son, and he thought, I'm the son of Saul, I should be king. And so the other 11 tribes pledged their loyalty to him. Well, your father was king, so now we'll give you loyalty. David had the loyalty of one of those tribes. And so David goes here to Hebron. Hebron, you may remember this, those of you that are thinking, how do I know Hebron from the Bible? 1,000 years earlier than this, Abraham, when he came to the promised land, settled in Hebron. And so Hebron is where David's capital is. Notice where that is, right in the middle of the territory of Judah. And Ishbosheth makes his capital over here in Mahanaim. And so basically, he's on the east side of the Jordan. Now, I realize the green area there shows you the tribal areas that he was king over. He wasn't king over anywhere near that much because the Philistines were there. Think about, this is Beth-shan, by the way, where we were talking about the battle. The Philistines basically settled in all this land. And so Ishbosheth doesn't have much of a kingdom left, but he has got the allegiance of the tribes in the north. He has a general. I want to introduce to you the players that are going to play itself out. David's general of his armies is named Joab. Ishbosheth has a general of his armies who was the general of Saul's army, and his name was Abner. And they are going to play an important part as David now is king of just one tribe. How's this going to play out? Is there going to be civil war? Is David going to have to, he wouldn't kill Saul, is he going to have to go kill Saul's son? And here's how it plays out. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, so this is Abner, the commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, in other words, the city on the east of the Jordan. He made him king over Gilead, Asher, Jezreel, etc., all the other tribes. So those 11 tribes are called all of Israel. So David is king over Judah, and Ishbosheth, Abner, who has the real power because he's the head of the army, makes him king over the other 11. Well, it doesn't take very long before they decide this can't be the way that this stays. And so Abner, the son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. So what happens? So the two generals now are the main characters. And so Abner leaves the headquarters, goes down to this town of Gibeon. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and David's army went out and met them. And so they are coming from Hebron, and they come up to Gibeon. Now, you see Jerusalem there is not Jerusalem yet. Jerusalem isn't an Israelite town. The tribe called the Jebusites live there, and in fact, the name of the town is Jebus. So they meet at Gibeon. So, by the way, this is kind of important to know. Zeruiah, you're like, who are these people? Well, this one is important. Zeruiah is the sister of David. So Joab is his nephew and also the commander of his army as well. And so they met at the pool of Gibeon, and one group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other. Then Abner said to Joab, instead of having a battle here, let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us. So kind of a friendly exhibition match that doesn't turn out to be a friendly exhibition match. And so, all right, let them do it, Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, 12 men for David. Now, Ishbosheth and David are not here, just their generals, and their armies are there. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into the opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkat Hatzarim. So basically what happens, they get fighting, they lose their tempers, and all of them, they manage to kill each other. And so blood is shed and things get out of hand, and so the armies get stirred up and they have a battle right then and there between, it's a civil war, if you will, Israelite against Israelite. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's men. So Joab and his army won the field that day. You find out later they killed 360 men and lost only 20 themselves. And so Abner and his men flee. But that's not the end of our story, and this is where things start to get really complicated. There's a twist. So as they were running away, there were three sons of Zeruiah: Joab, his brother Abishai, and his younger brother Asahel, the youngest. And so these are the nephews of David. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a gazelle, and he chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. And Abner looked behind him and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he said. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or the left and take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. So what's happening here? So the armies of David, Joab's armies, are chasing. In other words, they routed the army of Abner, and they're all literally running away. Well, Asahel thinks, I'm going to go get a trophy. That basically, if you killed one of the enemy, you would take their sword and you would take their shield. You know, if they have any armor, you would take their armor, and that was your spoil, your trophy, and it would be, look at me, I killed this soldier and I have his weapons. Well, Asahel, being a young, rambunctious guy, says, I'm going to go get the armor of Abner, the general of the army, and I'm going to make a name for myself. So Abner says to him, turn aside. I know what you want. Fight one of the young men, take his armor. Don't continue to pursue me. But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. So Abner warned him a second time. He said, stop chasing me. Why should I kill you? How could I look your brother Joab in the face? But Asahel would not give up the pursuit. So Abner thrust his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there, and he died on the spot. And every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. So Joab and the army, when they got there, they realized he's dead. He's been killed by Abner. But Joab and Abishai, his brothers, now we have a vendetta. Now it's vengeance. It's no longer our king versus your king. This is Joab and Abner. And you're going to see this story of vengeance begin to take over and overtake events. And it's just so like events today. But basically, Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammah on the way, basically, as they were fleeing. Then the men of Benjamin, that's a way of referring to Abner's army, rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. And as Joab and the other army comes, Abner calls out, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers?" So let me pause there for a minute. This is probably one of the most profound statements in the Bible. So Abner is running away. He doesn't want to kill Asahel. He understands now this has gone beyond a political problem. This has gone beyond avoiding a war. Now this is personal. But he stops and he says, where do we end this? In other words, this is Israelite fighting Israelite. This is literally brother fighting brother, if you will. He says, how long will the sword devour? And you're going to see that this little feud and what comes from it is going to run through the rest of David's life. Abner's going to die in about 10 minutes, and Joab is going to live for another lesson. Nevertheless, through all of David's life, the implications of this are going to affect his entire kingship and everything that he does. And so I wanted to pause for a second and just meditate for just a second. I want to make a connection to Jesus out of this. And so David isn't condoning any of this, but you get this idea of violence. Why are we having violence here? We're having violence because there's a struggle for power. It's a very earthly, secular, normal way of fallen humanity. This is the story of humanity since the Garden of Eden, is a struggle for power, the shedding of blood, brother against brother. Jesus comes, and I want you just to think about how to change this trajectory, because that is the story of humanity. It's still the story of humanity today. And as long as vengeance is the ruling ethic, as long as the sword continues to devour, we will continue to see man's inhumanity to man. But think about the cross in this way. I just want you to, as long as we're here, I just want to stop for a second and frame the cross of Christ in this way. So you remember that Jesus is before Pontius Pilate. Jesus has been falsely accused. Jesus is here with a bunch of evil people who are in rebellion against God and have beaten him, and he's talking to Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate says, do you not realize that you need to answer my questions because I have the power of life and death? And he said, you don't have any power except what was given to you. He said, in fact, if I wished right now, my Father would send legions of angels and destroy you. In other words, you have no idea who really has power here. I could kill all of you in a moment. And if I were Jesus, I'd go, yeah, let's do that. I think that sounds really good. I think that's justice. In fact, it would be just, right? But think about what happens on the cross. Jesus breaks the cycle of violence. How long will the sword devour? Until somebody says enough. And instead of vengeance, Jesus sacrifices himself. Instead of hostility and division, Jesus brings healing through self-sacrifice. I'm not telling you that's all that the cross is about. I just wanted you to see the cross from that perspective, because it has huge implications for your life and my life. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, read Matthew chapter 5, and people look at that and they say, Jesus, that just makes no sense. Maybe that's an ideal. Pray for those who persecute you. Go the extra mile, turn the other cheek. What is all this really saying? It's saying, don't follow the cycle of Joab and Abner. Instead, emulate the sacrificial love of the cross. That's the way to break the cycle. That's the way to change the whole trajectory of humanity. And so the cross, I just wanted you to see the cross in this story, because what Jesus does is so antithetical to anything we normally feel. It's like an eye for an eye, and in fact, maybe two eyes for an eye. Let's basically have a feud. Let's have the vengeance. But I want you to think of the cross as breaking the cycle of fallen humanity and changing the trajectory of humanity from that point on. Well, unfortunately, Joab and Abner aren't quite able to do that. Let me pause and take a question here before we move on and see how this story plays itself out.
This goes back a little ways in your lesson, but what is the book of Jashar and where did it come from?
What is? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
The book of Jashar.
Oh, the book of Jashar. That's really interesting because no one actually knows what it is. So no one, it's mentioned, this isn't the only time it's mentioned in the Old Testament, but here's what it's thought to be. That word, that Hebrew word is really hard to translate. That's why it's not translated. That's the Hebrew word, Yashar. And so what people think it is that it was a record, not inspired by God. If it were, it would be in your Old Testament. But basically, it's a book of the exploits of the heroes. In other words, think about Samson and Deborah and Gideon and all of that. This was probably a well-known book to the Jews of the time as kind of a compendium of the heroic deeds. Think of it as just a very famous book that no one thought is inspired by God, but they're really great stories. Like maybe you and I as Americans might pick up a book and it would tell us about the founding fathers and the early people that were important in our country. It's something like that. There are a couple of other books that are referred to like this in Chronicles that we don't have anymore, but they were probably known at that time. So that's a good question, but it turns out no one actually knows, but it appears to be a story, a hero book, basically a story of heroes. So what happens after this? I'm going to fast forward the story just a little bit. And so Abner goes home, and when Abner gets home, he and Ishbosheth have a kind of falling out with one another. It's very political, very personal. I mean, this whole history is bending around people's passions and loves and hatreds and rivalries. And so he ends up falling out with Ishbosheth, and it's Abner who has the power. And so Abner decides, you know what, I'm going to make peace with David, and I'm going to unify this. The leaders of the 11 tribes will listen to me. Ishbosheth isn't much of a king anyway, doesn't do any fighting. He wasn't there with Saul. There's a reason he wasn't there with Saul. He's not a great leader. And so Abner decides, and he talks to the ruling elders, the leaders of the 11 tribes, and says, I'm going to go talk to David. Let's unify this. So Abner becomes a bit of a noble character in this story, and so he goes to meet David. Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help to bring all Israel over to you. When he says all Israel, he means the other 11 tribes. Good, said David, I will make an agreement with you. Now this speaks to David's character. It's like, look, I could kill you. You fought against me. You and your men tried to kill me for about 10 years. Nevertheless, David seeks peace. He seeks unity. And so he says, good, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, the daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. So let me remind you of this, because I don't know if we talked about it, but when David had slain Goliath, and he came into the palace, and Saul says, he's a rising young star, and he decides, I'm going to ally myself to him because the people really like him, and he said, you can marry my daughter, Michal. Well, pretty quickly, his mood changed, right? And so he decides he wants to get rid of David, and so David flees. In the meantime, he gives Michal to somebody else in marriage. And so David realizes that Saul had done this injustice, and so as the price to make peace, he said, I want you to bring my wife, Michal. He probably also has a pretty shrewd political move here as well. I mean, I don't know how he feels about Michal. Maybe he's been pining for her for 10 years. I do not know. But I do know this. Marrying into Saul's family is a great way to legitimate your kingship, right? He has no intention of killing Ishbosheth. He's not trying to wipe him out. That's what you would normally do. But if he marries his sister, Saul's daughter, it's kind of legitimates it, like I kind of am in the line of Saul. So he's got a couple of reasons for this. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, and her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, "Go back home," and so he went back. Now, I don't know why this made the Bible. But ladies, I hope you have a husband who will follow you and cry if you ever decide to leave. I mean, I hope you have somebody that loves you enough to just follow you weeping as you leave. I hope you never leave, actually. But this is an interesting passage. So Abner conferred with the elders of Israel, and he said, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king." They know that David's been anointed. They know that Ishbosheth is not a very good king. He says, "So do it now. The Lord promised David, by my servant David, I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of their enemies." Well, now he's hitting home because they're all out of their land. There are Philistines living in their houses. And so he not only says the Lord has anointed him, he said, but God said this is the man that will defeat the Philistines. And right now they need somebody to defeat the Philistines. Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, and so they would have the hardest feelings of anybody. But he spoke to them as well. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and for his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go and assemble all of Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a compact with you, and you may rule over all the 12 tribes." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So what's basically happening here? David makes peace with him and makes a contract and says, "I'm willing to unify them, and I'll be king, and we don't need to fight. And you have been very instrumental, basically, to bring the tribes together without war." Well, meanwhile, however, just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron because David had sent him away, and he went away in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner had come to the king, and the king had sent him away, and he's gone in peace. So Joab thinks, it's hard to know what he's thinking, but you can pretty much guess. And that is, first of all, I hate Abner. He killed my brother. Secondly, if we make peace with them, I'm going to have to shake hands and forgo my vengeance. And secondly, who's going to be king of the army if we have both Joab and Abner? So Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Should have killed him. We could have conquered them easily after that. Now he's gone. You know Abner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you're doing." In other words, he lied to you. He's just figuring out how to attack us. Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. So Joab goes out, sends messengers and said, "Oh, David wants to talk to you again. Come on back." And so he does. Now, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway, into the gate area, as though to speak with him privately, and there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. So he murdered Abner. David doesn't know that this has happened. Joab has taken things into his own hands. And so you see how this rivalry is coming to overtake events. What makes this particularly bad is, first of all, Abner comes back and he's got a peace treaty with David. And so here's Joab, and he thinks, well, we're just going to talk. Maybe he wants to come over and say, "No hard feelings. I understand that my brother was killed in battle. I understand that you warned him. You didn't want to kill him." He goes into the city gates. The city gate is kind of a neutral place. It's like going into the courthouse. That's where you settle disputes. I mean, if you read much Old Testament, you'll see anytime there's a dispute, they go to the elders in the city gates and they work it out. It's like going to court, right? So he takes him to this place of peace. The other thing is, Hebron is a sanctuary city. So what's a sanctuary city? 400 years ago, when they come into the land, in the law of Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says if someone murders someone else, then you should kill them, eye for an eye. But if someone kills someone else by accident, like manslaughter, an accident, then how are we going to even things up? Because I want an eye for an eye. Well, the person who accidentally killed someone could flee to one of these cities of refuge, and there were just a few, and you would live the rest of your life there, but no vengeance could be taken. It was a way of breaking the cycle of vengeance when the death was not intentional. Those things do happen, and that could happen there. And so here is Abner, who did not intend, did not want to kill him, and so he's in a sanctuary city, and he's in the city gate, and that's where Joab murders him. So what Joab did was just heinous. I mean, it was an awful thing to do from the eyes of God and from the eyes of the law. But he basically just took his vengeance. Well, when David found out about it, he realized this could blow everything up. Now, what does it look like? It looks like David was the deceitful person that said, yes, I'll make a contract with you. I'll make a peace treaty with you and all the elders. And the next thing you know is they just pick up Facebook and realize Abner's been murdered, right? And so they think David can't be trusted. And so what's happening with these two men threatens to blow up the whole unity of the nation. So what does David do? David, at that point, just publicly comes out and disavows Joab. He said, on your head be this blood. This was the wrong thing to do. And instead, he praises Abner as a man of honor trying to make peace. And Abner, not exactly a great guy, but I mean, he's definitely doing the right thing here. He's trying to avoid a war and make peace. And so David disavows Joab. And instead, he has a public funeral for Abner, and he himself walks behind the casket. And so David is making it clear to all of Israel, I wash my hands of this situation. Let me pause and see what question we have.
So was Abner being selfless? Was he a man of God?
Was Abner a man of God? Was he being selfless? Well, it's hard 3,000 years later to judge his motives. But here are your two possibilities, and I suspect the truth is probably a mix. On the one hand, Abner realizes he has the weak king. And so he also realizes that even if he wins, Ishbosheth is king. And he's not the guy to stand up to the Philistines, because their big problem is, how do we defeat the Philistines and get our houses back, right? And so that's his big problem, but here he is being forced into a dispute with David. Now, David hasn't attacked him, but he realizes Ishbosheth is not the leader. David's actually the leader that can defeat the Philistines. And so I think in that sense, he's doing what he thinks is best for Israel. Let's avoid a civil war that gets us no closer to getting our homes back. In fact, it makes us weaker, fighting one another, right? Secondly, I'd rather serve David because he's a better leader. He's the one that was defeating the Philistines early on before Saul started chasing him. He had huge success fighting the Philistines. So you've got this pragmatic side. There might also be a spiritual side, that I know that God has anointed David, and I know that it's wrong for brother to fight against brother. So it's hard to know how much of this is practical and how much is spiritual. And I would guess, like most of us, those motives are mixed to some degree. So great question. But that's an interesting point, and that question highlights it. Everything you see happening here is real life. And I don't mean by that everybody's motives are impugned. I just mean that all of us as human beings, our motives are usually a little mixed. Now, the call of the gospel is to purify our motives and surrender ourselves to God and be completely about the business of God in this world. In other words, I surrender my will to you. my old self has died. This is the gospel. My old self has died, along with its selfish ambitions, along with its desires for vengeance, along with its desire for power, and I follow Christ. And yet, as we become sanctified, as we become more like Christ, we realize that we as human beings do have mixed motives. Even people that don't believe in God, they sometimes have noble motives and ignoble motives, and they're usually mixed. And so what you see is, in this story, you see the complexity of real human life. That's what makes the Bible so unique. I'll just get on a soapbox for a second. When you read other sacred books of other traditions, and I'm not trying to impugn them, I'm going to give you my impression, is you basically see kind of one-dimensional characters. Now, adherents of that would disagree with me. But when I read it, I see very sanitized versions of history, and I see very one-dimensional people. To me, when you read three-dimensional characters, and this story has not been sanitized by a PR firm at all. I mean, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly in this. That speaks to the authenticity of the Bible. And so I do like the fact that the Bible is there in all its gritty reality with all the complexities of human motives. And yet, the thread that's going to run through this is the vengeance and the earthy, sinful nature of Joab is going to run through this. But at the same time is going to be the faithfulness of David is going to run through this story. And we'll see how God architects the reality of human choices and human will into achieving what he promised David. So, David disavows this. And so all the people took note of what David did and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people in all Israel, in other words, all the Judah and all the other 11 tribes, knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner. Then the king said to his men, "Do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day?" He's talking about Abner. "And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." And so here you see a split between David and Joab. And he basically is saying, these sons of my sister are too violent for me. I seek peace, they sought vengeance. And so he's distancing himself from them. But notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't discipline Joab. He doesn't remove him as the head of the army. He doesn't actually do anything. And this is going to be a little flaw in David that you're going to see repeated. And it's going to bear some very bad fruit for him. And so, even though he publicly disavows Joab, he does nothing to him. Joab remains the head of his army, and off they go. In the meantime, and they'll take a question, Ishbosheth realizes, I'm without a commander of the army. Well, it turns out not to be a big deal because two of his men murder him, cut his head off, and bring it to David. And David sees that, and they said, hey, we're thinking reward, tip. He says, I'll give you a tip, and he kills them. He says, this is not how we make peace. I have no desire to kill Saul. I had no desire to kill Ishbosheth. And so when the leaders of the tribe see this, they realize David's motives are pure. David wants to serve God. David wants to unify us. And so David, very high in their estimation, and David wants to be above this idea of vengeance and people getting back at one another. And so finally, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, we are your flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns, and the Lord anointed you, saying, you will shepherd my people, you will become their ruler. When all the elders of Israel, all 12 tribes, had come to David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. And so finally, God's promise from a decade earlier, maybe a little bit more, comes true. But the interesting thing about this is David doesn't seize the kingdom. He doesn't kill Saul. He doesn't kill Ishbosheth. He doesn't fight a big war. God delivers it to him because he is faithful to wait on God's promise and do things God's way, not David's way. Question?
How did the tribes know that David was anointed to be king, especially since Saul had a son who might have been the king?
Yeah, how did the tribes know that David had been anointed? That knowledge was actually wider spread. We have to go back in the story, and I just didn't highlight this for you. But if you remember, when Saul is trying to kill David, Jonathan comes and says, look, Dad, he's going to be king. The Lord's chosen him, and I'm going to be his number 2. And Saul says, no, as long as he's alive, you'll never be king, and I want you to be king. And then later, remember when David cuts off a part of his robe and doesn't kill him? You know, the second time that happens, the second time he spares Saul's life, Saul says, I know that you are going to be king. So the idea of David's anointing gets out over the years, and people know that Samuel anointed him king. He's supposed to be next. Saul just wouldn't accept that. It was going to be Jonathan. And then when he died, the other tribes said, well, I guess it's going to be Ishbosheth. But you can tell that they realize we're not exactly lined up with God on this one. So the word had gotten out through those years. I want you to think of like 10 years have passed since our lesson 2 weeks ago. And so the word has gotten out. So they know that he's been anointed by God. And they hope that that's true because they hope he can somehow, against all odds, defeat the Philistines and be the leader that will lead them to victory. So one last little thing. We're going to talk in our next lesson about as David now, he's king. Does he win? Can he defeat the Philistines? I mean, the Israelites, they literally have been kicked out of the promised land. What are they going to do? David takes it over in terrible shape. How does that play out? And how does it work? And that's our story for the next lesson. But one little thing he does here that's just tucked into chapter 5, but it's a big deal to us, is one of the first things he does when he's king. I want to show you his dilemma. This is political again. So basically, David's here in Hebron. And so they come to Hebron, and all the leaders of the 12 tribes anoint him king. But he's king over this whole area. And so he realizes, I need a strong image to them that I'm a unifying king. I don't want to leave my capital in the middle of the tribe of Judah. And so he decides, I want to move my capital to a neutral site, kind of like a Washington, D.C. thing, by the way, which is why Washington, D.C. is Washington, D.C., right? It's a neutral site. It doesn't favor anybody. So he looks at this little town called Jebus that's literally right on the border. Literally on the border between those tribes in the north and the other tribes. And he says, that would be a perfect place for my capital city. Only problem is we don't own it, right? The Jebusites are in there. The other problem is, I'm going to start calling it Jerusalem, but this is when it gets its name, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, I should have brought a map of this, is sitting on a hill, and it's got huge valleys all around it. I mean, it is a great place to defend. In fact, when David goes to conquer it, let me just show you, I think I put in here what the Jebusites say. So the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can defend this place. Well, that's kind of true in the sense that you're going to go down and you're going to come up. You have a terrible position to try to overrun this. They've got walls. They're not like mega walls at this time, but they're big enough. They've got archers. I mean, it's going to be a tough place to take. And so they're taunting him, saying, we could put blind and lame soldiers here and you can't take this place. So nanny, nanny, boo-boo. Basically, that's kind of what they're saying. It's just in Hebrew. And so you will not get in here. And they thought, David cannot conquer this place. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. That's why Jerusalem is called the city of David. David and his men conquered that place. How did they conquer that place? On that day, David said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the lame and blind shall not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it and basically fortified it. So I want to tell you how they took this city. This isn't because he did not storm the walls. The Jebusites were right. So this is the city of David. I'm going to draw on this just a little bit. This is just kind of cool because when you go to Israel, and I'm hoping that you all do in about a year and a half with us, you are going to walk in this tunnel. All right, so here is the fortified area. Problem is, when you get attacked, you need water. They're sitting on a hill, but there's a spring underground called the Gihon Spring. And so what they did was they dug this shaft down to the spring, and they dug a little tunnel, and you can't see any of this from the outside, but they could basically lower buckets down here and get into this spring, and they've got this spring water to drink. I mean, they're literally impregnable. You can't, get them out of there because you make them thirsty. So I want to show you an even better map. Okay, so this is a side view. So this is the city of David. This is the Jebusite city. Underground, you have the Gihon Spring right here. They built a little tunnel, and they built a shaft to go up. And so you could literally walk down, go down the shaft, and usually this tunnel's flooded, by the way. And so you could just drop a bucket down and get it. You see this Hezekiah's tunnel? Pretend that isn't there. That isn't going to get built for 200 years. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We use that in another lesson 200 years from now. But basically, nobody knows that this is how they get in. David found out about this. I don't know how David found out. I don't know if he found a server and got a hard drive off of it. I don't know if he hacked into their emails. I don't know how he found out, but he found out. And he realized if we can get some men to dig down here and go through this tunnel and climb up this shaft, we could enter the city and they don't even know we're coming. It's like a Trojan horse type deal. This shaft, by the way, is called Warren Shaft because it's in the Bible, but it wasn't discovered until like 1867. I mean, just 150 years ago. And so people were like, really? That's in the Bible, but there's no archaeology. Well, there is now. That is Warren Shaft. That is that shaft. And so Joab and his men skinny along a tunnel, which we walked through, by the way, when we were in Israel. And then they climbed up and they burst in this middle of the city. They conquered the place without a battle. I mean, Jebusites aren't even really ready. They're like, hey, there's no way this guy can take it. And so David conquers it without even a battle. And so from that time on, Jerusalem was called the city of David because David and his men took that city. He made it his capital. And in fact, kind of the story of Israel now turns from Sinai, where the 10 Commandments were given, and Jerusalem becomes the center of their story now because that's the capital of the unified tribes. Finally, 400 years after Moses and Joshua led them in, God's promise is fulfilled that you will have this promised land. Why did it take 400 years? Because of the Israelites' lack of faith. But God's promises come true. Finally, 400 years later, on this Mount Zion, in Jerusalem, and all of Israel is united. Only problem is about half the land is overrun by Philistines, but that'll be David's problem next week. I like to end these with just the story of the Psalms. This is Psalm 18, and this is a song that David composed. A lot of them also are prayers. They read like a prayer. This is a psalm that was composed during this time. When he is finally, well, here's what it says. He sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He says, the Lord, and I love this, and I would just urge you in times of trouble to come to this psalm. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation. I call to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. See, David doesn't say, I'm a great general, and that's why I won. He doesn't say, we're a better army, and that's why we won. Or the breaks went our way, or something. He says, God is who I turn to in my trouble, and God has fulfilled this. God has done what he said he would do. I had to wait 10 or 12 years for that to happen. I mean, I think that's an important part of his story. But I remained faithful, and I always knew he would do what he said he would do. And he does. And then, as David usually does, he basically cries to God for help. From his temple he heard my voice. My cry came before him, and when it did, the earth trembled and quaked. This sounds a lot like Revelation at this point. When God shows up, everybody gets afraid. The earth trembled and shook, and the foundations of the mountains shook. They trembled because he was angry. The justice of God is coming. And then I skipped some of this. You armed me with strength for battle. You made my adversaries bow at my feet. You made my enemies turn their back in flight, and I destroyed my foes. They cried for help, but there was no one to save them. In other words, the justice of God. God's faithful to his promises. And he finally says, therefore I will praise you among the nations, O Lord. I will sing praises to your name. David understands why God made this promise to Israel is so that Israel could be a sign for the nations. God didn't choose the Israelites because they were better, smarter, more handsome than anybody else. He chose them for a specific mission, to be a light to the rest of the world. And I want you to remember that, because as David begins his kingship, that's what he does. He becomes God's ambassador to the other kingdoms of the world, and he begins to fulfill what Israel has done. He is basically an archetype of Christ, because what does Christ do? Christ comes to be a witness to the nations, a savior, something David can't do, but Jesus can. And who are we? We are God's chosen people. Why? Because we're smarter or better looking? No, because we placed our trust in him, and he gave us a mission. And what was his mission? The same thing that Israel was, to be a light to all the people in the world, and to go spread the good news of God's kingdom literally coming on earth. David's little kingdom in history is a precursor to the kingdom of God, the church in the world today. Make sense? That should give you goosebumps. You have more connection with David than any other political connection you and I have, any other ethnic connection you and I have. We have a really powerful spiritual connection to David. Well, given that David is human and his motives aren't always pure, and David's going to make some mistakes, next we'll see the reign of David and the defeat of the Philistines. And so David now fulfills his destiny, and the way that happens is typically convoluted. So thanks for your attention, and we'll follow the continued exploits of David next week. Oh, and don't forget Joab. He's not done yet.